So welcome everybody. Today's presentation is going to be led by Dr. Amy Walters, and of course the connection between mood and food. Dr. Walters is the Director of Behavioral Health Services for St. Luke's Humphreys Diabetes Center and works with patients to address their emotional and behavioral factors, which can negatively impact health and chronic disease management. And she's also a clinical consultant to the St. Luke's Children Integrative Medicine Program. Dr. Walters does a lot of professional presentations on behavioral health integrations, such as today's, and does some great motivational interviewing and psychological factors that impact chronic disease. I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Walters for many, many years, and so it's always a pleasure to have her present and provide her insight. So thanks to everybody who's joining us. And with that, Ms. Walters, I'm going to hand it over to you and have you lead us through your presentation.
That sounds great, Lisa. Thank you so much. And great to see you as always. I was really excited to be asked to present on this topic because it's something that we talk a lot about, but don't always know the research behind it. So it gave me a great opportunity to dive back into the research and look and see what some of the studies were that really give us more information about this food-mood connection.
I'll turn this down, although I'm surprised you're not watching this.
And somebody is not muted, so if you don't mind muting, that would be fantastic. So everybody can hear okay. There is a great article that I have listed for you here that came out of Frontiers in Psychology that really is a very nice review of the literature. So if you're wanting more information about some of the studies that I talk about today, that's a great reference point for you. Our objectives are going to be talking a little bit about the basic physiology of the brain-gut connection. I want to review some of just the key research findings and then talk a little bit about how the food choices that we make can really impact our mood and hopefully give you a few pointers to make sure you're making great healthy choices to keep your mood in a good place. So first of all, let's just talk about the power of food. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, both personally and professionally. I come from a large Italian family where everything is about the food. Every vacation, every family gathering is based on how fantastic or not so fantastic the food was. So really came from a foodie culture. And then professionally, I work at the Diabetes Center and here at Children's Integrative Medicine, working with people on lifestyle and lifestyle choices. So it's a great topic for us to jump into today. And so for those of you who have not yet figured this out, food is a very potent natural reward for us. And we know that food intake is actually a very complex process that involves different biological, psychological, sensory factors. So we're going to just touch on a few of those today. We know from research that food actually activates both the reward and pleasure centers of our brain, and that we get a sense of gratification from certain foods that we eat, and that's due in part to dopamine production, which we'll talk a little bit more about. We see patterns in people's eating habits where they routinely and repeatedly eat certain foods in order to experience those feelings of gratification. And you can probably think about your own choices that go to that list. Hopefully it's some of the healthy options that we have on the top of the page, but maybe it's something else like Doritos or Twinkies or something like that. And if so, we'll talk about what that looks like for you. Repetitive food intake really does activate that reward pathway. And one of the things that we see is that that's such a strong activation that it can actually override some of our natural signals for satiety and hunger. So we want to have an understanding of that as we talk today. People engage in a variety of different behaviors to regulate their mood. They may do favorite activities. They may also choose certain foods in order to help with that mood regulation. We do see this interaction between our emotional state and our feeding behaviors. And again, this is a very complex relationship. So I'm going to give you some basic information about that, but please know that if it's something that you really want to understand in detail, it's something that takes more time and interest in study. People are going to regulate their mood by changing both their food choices and their food quantities. And you may have noticed this yourself, that when you have had a rough day and you're really stressed, you may crave certain types of foods. You may notice yourself eating more or less of certain items than you do on days when your mood's in a different state. And that mood can affect these self-reward mechanisms within the brain. So I've mentioned this complex relationship. We really see some bi-directional links between mood, food intake, and brain signaling. And these different factors run in a bi-directional mechanism, meaning one impacts one way and it also impacts the other way. So I like this graphic because I think it's a nice visual of some of the things that we're seeing here in terms of food intake, mood, weight management, and different biological factors in the body. So let's just jump into that a little bit. One hopefully not surprising factor is that food does improve our mood. And we see this in both animal and in human studies, that hunger in its state by itself really leads to feelings of irritability, and that when we find food that we like to eat and we start to, partaking in it, it can actually lead to increases in alertness and arousal. Many people notice this in the afternoons when their mood starts to sag, and sometimes if they get a little something to eat, something to drink, that can kind of perk them up with that arousal and alertness. And it is this phenomenon that actually drives our biological instinct to search for food. Once satiety is reached, so we were really hungry, we were grumpy, and we were sagging, and we get in and we get something good to eat, and we notice that increase in alertness and arousal, and then get to this place of feeling full and satisfied, we tend to see a positive mood state and calm behaviors result. And I think one of our best examples of this is, after the Thanksgiving dinner, people are relaxed and they're enjoying it and the mood is good and it feels great. And we've got a whole bunch of studies that really support that biological phenomenon. We also see this connection between food and emotion, that mood disorders are actually associated with a number of abnormal feeding behaviors. We see higher rates of depression and anxiety in people who struggle with obesity. And we see a higher risk of developing depression for those who have diabetes. That rate is actually double. So individuals who struggle with insulin resistance and diabetes tend to have much higher rates of depression. And that depressed mood is also associated with higher rates of abdominal obesity and poor dietary choices. So we start to see this bi-directional relationship playing out. We also see a bi-directional association between insulin resistance. So higher rates, as I mentioned, of depression among our patients with diabetes. And there was a nice systematic review of the literature, which is actually kind of a hallmark when we look at research, when we can see certain findings over and over and over again. And one consistent finding that came out of that research review was this significant link between depression and insulin resistance. So food comes into play when we start talking about stress. Stress may increase or decrease our motivation to eat, and it will also impact our food choices. We see in people who struggle with chronic levels of stress, you may notice an intake in terms of the types of food that you're eating, really searching for foods that are highly palatable, and we'll hear that word regularly in the research. These are foods that tend to be high in salt, fat, and sugar. So there are highly palatable foods that have been actually genetically engineered to be that way. These tend to be really rewarding in nature, and they lead to more weight gain. In other people, we may actually see the opposite pattern, where stress creates a loss of appetite and a diminished desire to eat. But definitely, we see this pattern in the research where food choice, so whether we're choosing French fries or fresh fruits and vegetables, the quantity that we eat and the frequency that we eat is influenced not only by our biological drives of hunger and satiety, but also by these psychological factors of mood and stress. So the struggle is real. And if you've ever had that experience where you've had a really rough day and you just are craving chocolate and you go for it, we know that there's research to support that phenomenon. Stress-induced preferences for palatable foods are seen in both humans and animals. So when animals and humans are in a state of high stress, we crave certain foods, and we tend to crave those foods that we know are going to have an immediate impact on our mood. Chocolate happens to be one of them. Chocolate has very strong effects on mood and generally increases these pleasant feelings and a reduction in tension. So it's a very natural drive that we have to go for that chocolate bar during these times that we're stressed. We see a higher preference for comfort foods among people who are struggling with depression, and many will report that it really does, in the moment, alleviate some of those negative emotions. But unfortunately, there's this vicious cycle that people tend to fall into with comfort foods. So in the short term, in that very moment where you've had that rough day and you swing into the convenience store on the way home and you pick up the chocolate bar and you're in your car and you're enjoying it, we do get this relief from negative emotions and kind of a boost in our mood and our energy. But unfortunately, it doesn't last for long. So it's there short term, but chronic consumption of calorie-rich foods really tend to lead to issues with unwanted weight gain, which has a number of negative health complications. In addition to that, we also see increased vulnerability for depression and anxiety. So it's this strange combination where in the beginning, mood gets a little better, but if we do that for long periods of time, we actually see a drop in mood. And then that depressed mood leads to more emotional distress, which tend to lead to an increased desire for comfort foods, and the cycle goes round and round. One study that was published in 2012 really pointed to that connection and the prolonged high-fat diets leading to negative emotional states and increased stress sensitivity. And I think this is a really critical finding because we see a lot of fad diets that really focus on high-fat consumption, especially highly processed fats, can actually have some long-term negative effects on mood. So not only does a diet high in saturated fat have a negative impact on your waistline, but it also impacts your mood. In some of the animal studies, when we look at prolonged exposure to high-fat diets, and then they're switched to a normal diet, these animals show increased cravings for sugar, increased cravings for high-fat foods, and higher rates of anxiety or anxious behaviors. Similar findings have been found in studies where there are signs of depression and anxiety that are reported when people are used to a very high-fat diet and then switch to a regular diet. So when we think about the impact of that long-term, sometimes people turn to these foods that are high in fat, high in sugar, these highly palatable foods. They notice an improvement in their mood, but over time, we actually see a rebound with increased rates of depression and anxiety. So that chronic high-fat feeding promotes negative emotional states, increases our sensitivity to stress, and can really lead to repetitive cycles of overeating, weight gain, and depressed mood. And this has been shown in multiple studies, as you can see there at the bottom of the slide. So neurotransmitters play a role in this, and it's beyond the scope of our talk today to get into great detail on this, but I do want to touch on a couple of them because it's something that I think people start talking about, and having a basic understanding of it is helpful. So there are several neurotransmitters that are involved in our eating behaviors, and those include serotonin, dopamine, naturally occurring opioids, and GABA. Dopamine is one that you hear about a lot in the research on substance abuse, and that's because it really mediates that reward pathway. So what we see with food intake is that dopamine plays a large role in the wanting and the craving or the approach behaviors, where you're thinking about it and you're obsessing about it and you really want that chocolate and you can't get it off your mind, more so than the actual enjoyment in and of itself. In rodent studies, dopamine plays a role in determining the size of the meal, the duration of the meal, and also the obesity that results from long-term eating. The neurochemistry and reward systems involved in addiction with drugs and alcohol translate nicely into an addiction model for overeating and obesity because of that dopamine pathway. So we see this link between overeating and what begins to develop into an addictive behavior. There are continuous overeating patterns can really be viewed as very similar to other addictive behaviors, such as drug and alcohol abuse or addictive gambling. Dopamine signaling pathways are central in the overeating behaviors, and they're also central in drug abuse. This overwhelming urge to seek and consume are really hallmarks of addiction. And overindulgence involves a loss of control due to impairments in the brain circuits for decision-making, self-control, and regulation of mood and stress. So much like we see in our patients who struggle with addiction with alcohol or with highly addictive drugs like heroin, there's this loss of control and really an impairment at the basic brain level when it comes to self-control and regulation. And we see something very similar to that in highly palatable foods. They really have the potential to engage those reward systems within the brain, similar to that as seen in drug abuse. And so when we look at our brain-based data and some of our imaging studies, we really are finding that food can truly be addicting. And this was a point of argument and contention among psychologists for years. You know, how can food, something that we need to survive, be addicting? But when you start looking at some of the highly palatable foods that are available in our environment, this is truly what we're seeing. When we look at functional MRI and PET scans, we've seen differences in regions of the brain that activate for normal weight adults versus adults struggling with obesity. And in our patients with obesity, we see neurobiological changes in the reward pathways, very similar to those observed in people with drug and alcohol addiction. And that was not observed in patients who were of healthy weight. So we see a physiological change once people reach that state and are struggling with obesity, that we actually may see changes in the brain. Neurobiological data obtained from both human and animal studies of food cravings and overeating really support this addiction-like model. And we're seeing that in behavioral studies, and we're seeing that in brain-based studies. Serotonin also plays a role in this. Serotonin has multiple functions. It's another neurotransmitter within our body. It helps us with regulation, and it regulates our mood, it regulates our sleep, it regulates our appetite, and it regulates our impulses, all of which are very important for eating behaviors as well as a number of other behaviors. Many people are not aware of this, but I attended a presentation by a pharmacist at one point early in my training who shared that the gut is a big producer of serotonin, and that 80 to 90% of the human body's total serotonin actually comes from the gut. So it starts to make sense, this food-mood connection, because some of these neurotransmitters that are really involved in mood regulation are absolutely impacted by our food choices and by our gut health. Serotonin release in the brain is governed by our food intake. So when we have foods that we really enjoy, up goes the serotonin level. And we also see the diet rich in healthy carbohydrates can relieve depression and help elevate mood. In comes our culture. It wouldn't be a good psychological talk if we didn't talk a little bit about the environment and the culture in which we live. And this term obesogenic culture is something that you're seeing more and more in the popular literature as well as in the scientific literature. Our Western society has really created a challenging environment when it comes to healthy lifestyle choices. And here at the Children's Integrated Medicine Clinic, we talk about this all day long, that sedentary lifestyle and a surplus of highly palatable foods that activate that dopamine reward center really lead to overconsumption. When we look at sedentary lifestyle, 2 out of 3 Americans don't meet recommended activity levels. And then we're immersed in this environment full of fast and convenience foods that are really delicious, that activate that reward center in our brain. Some of these foods have actually been engineered to do this. And especially when we talk about this tasty triad of fat, sugar, and salt, it really overcomes us and our ability to regulate in those situations. So hyperpalatable foods that are easily available promote addictive and compulsive eating and often lead to weight gain. So there's a cost to this culture. At least 1/3 of adults and 17% of minors in the US are obese, and there is a number of negative health ramifications that go along with this. Obesity is the second leading cause of preventable death, contributing to 300,000 deaths each year. And the healthcare burden of obesity and obesity-related disease in the US is estimated to hit 861 to 957 billion by the year 2030. So the way that we interact with food and the choices that we make to consume food have long-term implications for our health and the state of our health system. So thinking about food in a different way would be helpful. And one saying that I really like is, food is medicine. And long, long ago, Hippocrates had the quote, "Let your food be your medicine and your medicine be your food." So we know from the research that we've just touched on briefly here today that food directly influences neurotransmitter systems, affects our mood and our performance by altering our brain structure, our brain chemistry, and our brain physiology. And our Western diets, which are rich in saturated fat and low in polyunsaturated fat and monounsaturated fatty acids, increase the incidence of depression. There's lots and lots of research to support this connection between depression and poor diet. And what we actually see is that a Mediterranean diet which appears to reduce depression in a number of different studies.
Hey, Amy. Amy, can you hear us?
I think you accidentally muted yourself, Amy. Somehow your picture has a little mute sign on it.
Yeah.
I don't know what, oh, I don't know what happened.
That's really interesting. Is it fixed now?
Yes,
Yep,
thank
you're
you.
good. Thank you.
That's crazy because I didn't even touch my computer. Okay.
That's happened to a couple presenters lately, so you're not alone.
It's the gremlins of Teams. Okay, here we go. So some food for thought. If we want to make these healthy lifestyle choices and we want to really maximize our food mood connection, what do? We go with whole food, plant-based nutrition. When we are choosing proteins, making sure that we're picking lean options, looking at those healthy fats, and really limiting the sugar and the processed foods. Now, you may be saying, now, Amy, I'm confused. You said that those things will boost my mood. And try to remember that that's a short-term fix, that while chocolate is delicious and in small quantities for treats can be okay, if we're engaging and indulging in these foods on a regular basis, what we see is a beginning increase in mood and then a sharp decline. And that over time, that decline can actually become a rebound and can become very persistent in nature. So going with our whole food, plant-based, lean proteins is going to be a much better option. So in summary, highly palatable foods, which are plentiful in our environment, those high in saturated fat and processed carbohydrates really do induce cravings and then send us into that vicious cycle that we discussed. The obesogenic culture that we live in increases the likelihood of food addiction and overconsumption, which then leads to depression and obesity. And remember those brain-based studies, that what we are seeing is a pattern very much like substance abuse addiction when it comes to food addiction for people who are falling into these patterns. We see that the foods that we eat have a direct impact on our mood, and that choosing healthy carbohydrates from plant-based sources can have a positive impact by reducing depression and increasing energy. So we want to treat our food as medicine, really creating a supportive food environment and making the healthy choice the easy choice. That's a saying that I hear frequently around St. Luke's, and I love that saying. We use it at the Diabetes Center, and we also use it in the Pediatric Lifestyle Medicine program. We want to make the healthy choice the easy choice. So what does that look like? One of the things we can do, just like we baby-proof our homes when we have a baby coming in, is kind of junk-proof our homes to support healthy diets. I once had a patient tell me, you know, if I say no at the store, I only say no once. If I bring it into my house, I have to say no every time I walk by. So really thinking about creating a positive food environment for yourself that supports those healthy food choices, rich in complex carbohydrates. Whole food, plant-based diets, rich in produce, healthy fats, and lean protein not only help us physically, but help us emotionally as well. So I wanted to make sure and save time in case we had some questions.
Hey, Amy, there's a couple in the chat bar. Are you able to see them, or do you want me to read those?
If you can read that to me, Lisa, that would be great. In my current screen view, I'm not able to see the chat box.
No problem. So Kim asks, has research found a direct correlation on insulin resistance and brain chemicals? If not, any thoughts on the impact on depression? Is this equally true across type 1 and type 2?
So we do see increased rates of depression in the literature among type 1 and type 2 patients. The incidence among our patients with diabetes tends to be about 30 to 50%, and that relationship seems to be bidirectional. So people with diabetes have a higher risk of depression, and people with depression have a higher risk of diabetes. We don't know the specific neurochemistry of that yet, but the fact that it's bidirectional really is an interesting finding. So for patients with diabetes, pre-diabetes, diabetes, type 1 or type 2 diabetes, it really is important to be making those healthy lifestyle choices and making careful food choices, thinking about food as medicine and choosing those things that are going to help reduce insulin resistance instead of making it worse.
Awesome. And then there was a request for that link to the article that you referenced at the very beginning. Looks like Michael Hobson might have dropped that into the chat, but after we end, if you want to look at the chat, it's not right, you can all plop that back in there for us, Amy.
Absolutely, and I can send that out too.
Awesome. So Kim asked, have you researched the impact blood type may have on food choice and how our bodies process different types of food? She's heard about it and she's curious.
That's a great question. I've heard people talk about that, and unfortunately that is not my expertise. I'm not able to answer that one for you, but perhaps that could be a future speaker.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And then Nicole wanted to know if you could speak a bit about gluten and gluten-free foods. She keeps hearing to avoid both. Is there any bread that's okay?
All great questions. You guys are coming up with a fantastic list here. And I think some of those actually would probably be best answered by a dietitian. I will tell you that for patients with celiac disease or gluten sensitivity, that can have a very significant impact on mood and energy levels. It also impacts our absorption. So for people who have those dietary sensitivities, it is important to be careful and go with gluten-free options. In terms of specific products, I don't really have a list for you there, but definitely looking for those whole grain options that are high in fiber, foods rich in protein are going to be helpful. And some patients that I work with do notice, even though they haven't been diagnosed with celiac disease or any kind of gluten sensitivity, they have reported improvement in both energy and mood by reducing gluten from their diet. So I think some of those things, you know, we can experiment with, and definitely on an individual basis, if you feel like that might be an option for you, eliminating something for a while and then making some other food choices to see if it helps can be helpful.
Great. Thanks, Amy. I'd also like to just suggest for individuals that might want to learn more about kind of this plant-based eating is that Lifestyle Medicine hosts the CHIP program, the Complete Health Improvement Program. We have a team member that just went through it and is raving about it. It's a really great way to learn about just incorporating more plants and kind of that Mediterranean lifestyle that you referenced. And so that's a great St. Luke's program that it is a really nice option for many of our employees. So it's Lifestyle Medicine that offers the CHIP program. And you can find it actually on the source. Oh, thank you, Michael. Michael's on it. He's dropped the link in there for us, Amy.
Fantastic.
Okay. We've got 2 more minutes. Are there any other questions or comments for Dr. Walters before we wrap up today's session? Oh, great. Krista asks, when a person changes their diet to cut out highly processed foods and sugar, is there any data out there about how long most people have ongoing cravings?
It's a great question. I'm not aware of the exact period of time, but definitely we do see that phenomenon where people will have increased cravings and also a dip in mood initially. From my clinical work, I would say for most people that tends to resolve between 6 to 12 months, but I don't know the data on that one for sure. The thing that I would tell you is if you can anticipate that change, know that it's going to be a bit of a struggle, try to have some great behavioral strategies during that time. So keeping the refrigerator full of other healthy options and the pantry, things that you like, making that healthy choice the easy choice, doing some other kinds of things that might help with increasing your fatigue that you may experience. So increasing physical activity, making sure that you're getting adequate sleep, making sure that you're scheduling positive social events and other things to look forward to, and then having some great distraction techniques and other behavioral strategies for avoiding those cravings.
Yeah, that's great. And then this is the final question because we're almost out of time. April asks, if someone is in a bad cycle, are there any tricks that can help break it?
That's such a great question, and lots of different strategies. So I guess in my short amount of time I have left, I would tell you, consider working with a behavioral health provider. Psychologists and other providers have fantastic training in motivation, behavior change, and learning new patterns. One tip would be start by understanding your patterns. So if you can keep a log to identify, what time of day is this happening? What am I doing while this is happening? What are some of the feelings that I'm experiencing? What are some of the thoughts that I have? And you can start to notice patterns, then we can start shifting some of those things. Using some of the basic principles and some of the 12-step programs can also be very applicable for eating habits. And again, trying to really create an environment that supports the healthy choices that you're wanting to make, making that healthy choice the easy choice. Also, one quick other tip, the American Psychological Association has a wealth of different information on their help center. So when you go to apa.org and you click on the help center, there are all kinds of different documents and materials there that people can access for health behavior change and healthy lifestyle.
As always, Dr. Walters, great information, wonderful to share all of this with everybody. Thank you so much to everybody for attending. I'll be sending out the link as well as a PDF of Amy's presentation to everybody on the call today. With that, we'll give your afternoon back. Again, thanks, Dr. Walters, and thanks everybody for joining. Hope everybody has a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you for having me.